Well, good evening, everybody. I'm Josh Rovner. I'm Director of Studies here at the SMU Tower Center. Welcome to the beautiful Meadows Museum. Welcome to this special event tonight, which is co-sponsored by the Tower Center for Political Studies at SMU, along with the World Affairs Council of Dallas-Fort Worth and the Dallas Committee on Foreign Relations. Our guest this evening is Ambassador Yousef Otaiba, who you'll hear from in just a second. And he's going to lead us in an extremely timely conversation about the U.S. relationship with the UAE, about political events in and around the Gulf at a time where this conversation has to happen, given the ongoing conflicts in Iraq and in the Gulf region, given concerns about the future of global energy markets, and with continuing concerns about issues ranging from terrorism to nuclear proliferation. Now is the time to ask questions and get a few answers. Ambassador Otaiba is well positioned to deal with these issues given his long experience working in diplomacy and his long experience in the United States. I'll note on his biography he was a student at National Defense University in Washington, D.C., and has spent a career in military affairs and in diplomacy, and he has extensive experience. Before we get going, I have a few people to thank. First, I'd like to thank the UAE delegation who is here with Yousef Otaiba. Thanks very much for joining us this evening. I'd like to thank board members from the Tower Center, including Lucy Billingsley, who's down at the end, Rena Peterson, and Marjorie Adams, who you'll see in just a minute. Thank you very much for coming. A special thanks to the World Affairs Council of Dallas-Fort Worth and its president, Jim Falk, who is lurking somewhere. It's a pleasure working with the World Affairs Council. We do lots of events together, and it's really great to combine the Dallas-Fort Worth community of people who have a deep interest in foreign affairs. And it's you in this room, and we couldn't do it without the World Affairs Council. We also couldn't do it without the Dallas Committee on Foreign Relations. Thanks very much to President Hugh Hackney and everybody involved in DCFR who's helped us coordinate this event tonight. Now I'll turn the mic over to Marjorie Adams, Tower Center board member and chair-elect of the World Affairs Council, Dallas-Fort Worth. Ms. Adams is president and CEO of Adams & Associates, an international consulting entity based in Dallas. She has worked in the Middle East for many, many years on a range of issues. And I should say, more than anybody else, she is responsible for tonight's event. Marjorie has done an extraordinary amount of legwork in organizing this event and roping together our three organizations to put this all together. So from me and from the Tower Center, thank you for what you've done, and I will turn the floor over to you now.
Good evening. Uh-oh. I'll just hold it. What a joy to see all of you here. I realize that it is an incredibly busy time in our community, and the fact that all of you could be here for the ambassador's visit and the UAE delegation means a great deal to all of us involved with this venue. It is important to highlight the relationship between the United States and the United Arab Emirates is about as significant as it can be between our country and any country in the Gulf region. The UAE, bar none, has stood by our side during very difficult times and have been always steady and reliable. And this is an important fact to understand before the ambassador begins his comments. The ambassador is a special person, and he, along with his staff and his boss, the Crown Prince of Abu Dhabi, His Highness Sheikh Mohammed bin Zayed, who's also the Deputy Supreme Commander of the UAE Armed Forces, with their leadership and other leadership in the UAE, they have transformed our relationship on multiple issues, which the ambassador is going to highlight further. The relationship that we enjoy between Abu Dhabi and the UAE and the great state of Texas is unique. It goes back many years, involving a lot of people, some of them in this room, Some of you are looking at me. We've all worked hard to do some very special things with the ambassador in the UAE. Our relationship is based on something very simple, which I know will resonate with you. It's based on friendship, common values, and trust. And I cannot emphasize that enough. The ambassador is going to share some of the challenges they are facing, but also the good news that is happening in the UAE. And at this time, I want to pass this on to a very dear friend who I consider a member of my family, Ambassador Yousef Otaiba.
No, I'm going to try to put this back. So after an introduction like that, I don't know what's left to say. I think the best thing I could do right now is just pack up and go home. The problem with these very, very generous introductions is it sets the bar very high for all of you, and I'm afraid now you're going to be disappointed. Let me just start by saying how nice and wonderful it is to be back in Dallas. And I say wonderful because, I live in DC, and every time I come down here, I am struck immediately by how nice, polite, and respectful everyone is. And really, I cannot tell you how welcome it is to see that. I think you guys are very lucky. I think the culture here is incredible, and it's always nice to be back in Dallas. I'm here today at what I think is a pivotal moment. We are just under 3 weeks away from the presidential election. And it's a very consequential election for Americans. But even in the UAE and across the region, people are watching the campaign very closely. Since US leadership and engagement remains critical to global stability, the outcome of this election has tremendous implications for the UAE and for the Middle East. The new president will have urgent business to deal with in the Middle East. US leadership will be essential to resolve current conflicts. But there is a unique opportunity for America to be part of positive change and a new wave of entrepreneurial thinking that has the power to remake the region. Just yesterday, the Center for American Progress released a report that offers recommendations to the incoming administration. The report highlights ways to strengthen partnerships, promote security, and advance US interests in the Middle East. The bottom line of the report was very clear, that the Middle East still matters. And the recommendations reflect a consensus among policy analysts and former government officials that span a very wide political spectrum, from the American Enterprise Institute to the Center for American Progress and centrist groups like the Atlantic Council and Center for a New American Security. They're all saying the same thing, and trust me, this rarely happens in Washington. There is an urgent need for renewed American engagement in the Middle East, and we completely agree, and we urge whoever moves into Pennsylvania Avenue in January to make this a priority. While the UAE and our Gulf partners are actively taking a broader leadership role in the region, US involvement remains indispensable to help address today's challenges. And let me be clear, the UAE and our partners are not along for a free ride. We are deeply invested in our joint security, ours and yours. I can stand here proudly and assure you that we contribute to the regional security just as much as we benefit from it. And along those lines, I'd like to discuss with you 3 key policy priorities for the incoming administration that experts agree on. First, there is broad agreement that Iran should be held accountable not just for its nuclear deal commitments, but also for its increasing regional aggression. We hoped that Iran could see the nuclear deal as an opportunity to turn over a new page. And no country is positioned to gain more from normalized relations with Iran than the UAE. Reducing tensions across the 100-mile wide Arabian Gulf could help restore full trade ties, energy cooperation, cultural exchanges. We could begin a process that could resolve a 45-year-old territorial dispute between our two countries. But ever since the deal, Iran has only intensified its posturing and its provocations. I could literally stand up here all day listing the transgressions of the Revolutionary Guards, from Yemen to Bahrain to Iraq to Lebanon. And I can go into great detail about how Iranian leaders have reaffirmed their commitment to strengthen their ballistic missile program. I can share with you the observations of Central Commander General Votel, who spoke yesterday in Washington and detailed the irresponsible harassment of US Navy vessels in the Arabian Gulf. But while Iran directs their energy towards instability and violence, I'd rather focus on solutions. In order to keep Iran accountable, the United States must call it like it is. Like when Iran tests missiles in violation of international agreements, or when they burn down foreign embassies in Tehran. We cannot afford to fixate on ISIS and Al-Qaeda, but ignore Hezbollah and the Quds Force. So what does that mean? It means continuing to impose sanctions on individuals and organizations involved with Iran's ballistic missile program. It also means upholding and intensifying sanctions designed to check the IRGC subversive activity and the consistent support for known terrorist groups. It means confronting increased Iranian undermining of America's interests in the region and the interests of your partners. Working together, we must take concrete steps to check Iran's aggression and make sure that they are contributing to a constructive path for the region, not undermining our collective progress. In short, Iran can be part of the solution, or it can continue to be part of the problem. Our second priority should be redoubling our efforts to confront extremism. This means not just ISIS and Al-Qaeda or Al-Nusra, but also undertaking a comprehensive campaign to root out violent, destructive groups that advance an extremist ideology, wherever they might arise. Now, there's a strong foundation to build on. We've made progress against that threat, and our concerted efforts are paying off. In April, coalition forces in Yemen drove out Al-Qaeda out of the strategic port of Mukalla and put Al-Qaeda's most dangerous affiliate on its heels. Just this month, a new report by IHS shows that ISIS has lost nearly a third of the territory it controlled at its peak in January of 2015. And after recapturing Fallujah, the Iraqi security forces are currently performing an operation to unseat ISIS from Mosul, Iraq's second largest city. Working together, I am fully confident in our ability to sustain the military effort. And again, I want to be clear, the UAE is actively involved with boots on the ground and wings in the air in the fight against extremists today. We fought the Taliban and Al-Qaeda in Afghanistan for 12 years with our American and NATO partners. And in a combined mission with the US Air Force, an Emirati woman fighter pilot led the UAE's first strike mission against ISIS targets in Syria. And in Africa, we're working with the US military to take on Al-Shabaab. Military cooperation between our countries has never been stronger. We look forward to continuing and building on this close cooperation with the new administration. Renewed alignment on policy will enable us to make the most of this military interoperability that we have today. But beyond the battlefield, we must continue to intensify our collective efforts in the area of countering violent extremism. The Sawab Center, which is a joint bilateral initiative, is confronting the spread of extremism online. The Hidayah Center, another collaboration with several partner countries, is developing a community-based solution to divert people away from radicalization in order to prevent them from reaching the battlefield in the first place. These and other initiatives are having an impact. Sawab reports that overall ISIS traffic on Twitter has plummeted by 45% in the last 2 years. I'm confident we can continue this progress, and I'm confident we can defeat the extremist threat. So there is a broad consensus that the US must hold Iran accountable, and that the extremists must be defeated. But we understand that the US cannot do this alone. And this leads me to the third and perhaps the most important pillar of future US policy towards the Middle East. the need to deepen and strengthen the relationship and the trust with your traditional allies. Partners like us contribute to America's security. We are the front line against Iran and extremism. We are making significant investments in our own collective defense interests, from putting our own soldiers in harm's way to buying billions and billions of dollars of US-made defense equipment, systems like F-16s, Apaches, Black Hawks, Chinooks, THAAD, and Patriot. Doubling down with your friends in the region should also go beyond the military realm. It means closer coordination on issues like climate change and educational and economic cooperation, expanded trade and commercial links, and deeper social and cultural ties. Deeper U.S. engagement with long-standing partners will not only help in confronting threats, but it will also give the U.S. an opportunity to work with countries like us to carve out a positive path forward in the Middle East. We are building an economic engine for the entire region, a place where the free flow of goods, services, people, investment, ideas lifts the entire Middle East and links it to Africa, Asia, Europe, and the Americas. Every year, a communications firm called Burson Marsteller conducts an Arab youth survey. And for 6 years in a row, young Arabs chose the UAE as the top country in the world that they want to live in. Also, they chose the UAE as the model they want their own countries to emulate. And young entrepreneurs picked it as the top place in the Arab world they would prefer to open a business. So the UAE is creating opportunities for today's youth that people in the region could only once dream of. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is the real antidote to extremism. It's when you create hope. It's when you create inspiration. Now, the US has been a vital partner in both the public and the private sector in helping create this new vision for the region. Let me just name a few examples. The UAE Space Agency, which has been only started about a year ago, works closely with NASA and US space industry to develop the HOPE probe, which we intend to send to Mars by 2021. And we picked 2021 because that will be the UAE's 50th birthday. McGraw-Hill Education, just this month, signed a 7-year agreement to provide ebook and print content for all of UAE's K-12 math and science instructional materials. And DC-based tech incubator 1776 announced this year that it will launch a campus in Dubai. But no place in the US has deeper and longer connections to the UAE than Texas. Major oil and gas firms operating in the UAE are based or have a major presence in Texas, including Exxon and Occidental Petroleum. Thanks to the partnership with Lockheed Martin, the UAE military has cutting-edge technology from fighter aircraft to missile defense. And just this past April, I was in Houston to celebrate the dedication of the Sheikh Zayed bin Sultan building for personalized cancer care at MD Anderson. A few weeks ago, Etihad Airlines announced that it was expanding its Dallas-Abu Dhabi route. So starting in February, there will be 21 nonstop flights between Texas and the UAE every week. All of this is a long way of saying that our two countries are connected and united as ever before. Not just in how we see threats, but more importantly in how we see the future. We are bound by much more than our shared interests in keeping the region and the world safer. We are also united in prosperity and in a common outlook. And while we are both realists about the world we live in, we're also countries of optimists and innovators. We are tolerant and diverse. We embrace free markets and free enterprise. These are the interests and the values that unite us. In exactly 3 months from today, the US will inaugurate a new president. And when he or she walks into the Oval Office, there will be a very long to-do list. And many of the most urgent items on that list will be in our neighborhood. But in taking on these challenges, the new president should know that my country is a committed and willing partner. We are united in strengthening security and stability, in advancing prosperity and opportunity, and in promoting tolerance and openness, because that's what successful partnership and better future requires. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen.
Thank you very much, Ambassador, for your comments. What we're going to do now is we're going to turn the floor over to a dialogue of ambassadors. Ambassador Otaiba will be joined by Ambassador Robert Jordan, who is U.S. Ambassador to Saudi Arabia, formerly U.S. Ambassador to Saudi Arabia, is currently a Tower Center board member and vice chairman of the board here at the Tower Center, where he also teaches classes on Middle Eastern politics. I will turn the floor over to both ambassadors now, and then we will open it up to Q&A for the room.
Great, thank you very much. Ambassador, it's truly a pleasure to have you here. I first met a young man named Yousef Otaiba, more than 10 years ago, I guess.
I was young back then. Yes.
We just sat around Marjorie's living room in jeans and t-shirts and talked about the state of the world. And what an amazing career you have had up to this point as well. You are certainly among friends tonight, and I know there are a lot of questions. We have cards around that people are encouraged to submit, and if you want to bring up some of the questions to me, I would like to start off, though, with a couple of questions that some of my students have raised. And we encourage all of you here to submit additional questions. But you have talked a lot about the relationship with the United States. There has been a serious move here in our Congress to allow lawsuits against countries that are involved in any kind of terrorist attack against American citizens. I know this has raised a tremendous amount of concern among our friends in the Middle East, and I would like you to address, if you could, your take on that.
So just the backdrop for those of you who are not familiar with the case, there's a bill that has been passed called JASTA. And what JASTA does, it allows private citizens to sue a sovereign country. There's a principle called sovereign immunity, and this is hundreds of years old, I think, from the days of Westphalia, which basically assures countries that individuals will not take legal course against sovereign states. Because if we do, kind of open it up and then we have no control. So states have agreed to deal with issues like this at a state-to-state level. This bill violates the principle of sovereign immunity. I definitely understand the need for the 9/11 victims to have their day in court. I definitely understand the need for them to feel that they have received the compensation they deserve. But my worry is, this exposes the United States far more than exposes any other country. Because if countries start passing their own versions of JASTA bills, they will start suing the United States for drone strikes, for covert operations, for military actions that have taken place in countries you have not declared war, for Guantanamo Bay. So there's no one who's more vulnerable to these types of lawsuits than the United States. Yet this logic does not exist when you talk to the people on the Hill. In fact, when I did raise these issues, they said, oh, no, we know, we understand, you're right. This is very harmful. But the politics and the emotion of the 9/11 issue, we couldn't vote against it. I had one member say, all politics is local. I couldn't vote against this in an election year. We fail to understand the consequences. Okay, it is political and it is emotional. what happens when other countries react politically and emotionally? And then relationships start to suffer. Marjorie said something very important when she started up here. She said relationships are based on trust, values, and friendships. What kind of signal do you send to your friends when you do that? And then how should your friends respond? So I worry about the precedent this sets. I worry about alienating your key allies. And I just gave a 10-minute talk about how it's important to rebuild that trust and reinvest in your friends in the region, because you're not going to be able to solve any of these problems without us. That sends the exact opposite signal.
Is the hangover effect of the passage of this legislation something that, in your view, might cause some of our friends in the Gulf to take retaliatory action?
I think there will definitely be countries who have already announced that they are going to explore certain reciprocal legislation. And surprisingly, France said it's going to. Pakistan said it's going to. I imagine Somalia, Libya, Yemen, countries who've had a history of U.S. military operations in there, those will be your first countries. But I think your friends will probably wait to see how this unfolds. If it's fixed, if it's tweaked, if it's limited, you probably won't. We don't want this relationship to suffer. We don't. We don't want to start looking elsewhere. But you also have to understand that actions carry consequences. If we are about to invest in the United States, and you pass a law that then says, well, we might be able to seize your assets if we find you liable in something, don't you think it would make us second guess investing in this country? I mean, and that's a normal, logical reaction. Again, I think the politics and the emotion have clouded this kind of analysis.
You mentioned briefly in your remarks the situation in Yemen. Could you give us a broader evaluation of the situation there as it stands right now? Where's it heading?
Let me start by saying why we're in Yemen, because I think we failed to make our case. People do not understand why the UAE and the Saudis and several others are deployed in a country, one of the poorest countries in the Middle East. Iran has publicly boasted about their capacity to now control 3 Arab capitals: Baghdad, Damascus, Lebanon, Beirut. 20 years ago, those capitals were run by Arabs. Today, those capitals are managed by Iran. Yemen borders, arguably, one of the most important countries in the region, Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia is important because, not only because it produces 10 million barrels of oil a day, more importantly, it is home to Mecca and Medina, home base, HQ of Islam. Now, that is incredibly important. So the reason we went into Yemen was because a group called the Houthi rebels, or the Houthi tribe, backed by Iran, ran through the country. The government, the legitimate government, fled, ran into Saudi Arabia, and began to control certain parts of the country. Now, we decided that we were not going to allow what happened in Iraq, Syria, and Lebanon to happen in Yemen. Not in a country that borders, a country that produces 10 million barrels and is home to Mecca and Medina. So we drew a red line, and we said we're not going to let this happen on our watch. So that's why we're in Yemen. I think that's very important to understand. Now, how does it look? Where does it go? We have 2 primary areas of focus in Yemen: fighting the Houthis, which are backed by Iran, and fighting Al-Qaeda and ISIS. Personally, I think the fight against the Houthis will eventually end through some kind of political reconciliation. They will sit down with the current Yemeni government, they will make a deal, a compromise that they can both live with. And at the end of the day, that's between Yemeni factions inside Yemen. That's for them to decide. So I think that will ultimately end. Whether it ends in 6 months or 12 months, I don't think anyone knows. The fight against terrorists, whether it's in Yemen or in Libya or elsewhere, I think we're going to be fighting it for a long time. So I don't imagine large-scale deployments, nation building to take place in Yemen for very long. But I do think we are going to be fighting extremists for a long time. So it will be more of this counterterrorism style operation, and I think that will go on for a long time. But I can't imagine us being in Yemen for very much longer.
There was a report, I think just today, that Egypt is supplying military hardware to the Houthis. Is that a reliable report? Have you seen that? And what in the world would Egypt be doing trying something like that?
No, I don't think that's accurate. Egypt is in our coalition, and they've deployed Egyptian naval vessels to actually blockade and prevent weapons from being smuggled in, either from Iran by maritime or through countries in the region. So no, I think Egypt, I don't think that report is accurate.
And speaking of Iran, what do you make of President Obama's statement that the Gulf countries need to share the neighborhood with Iran?
I disagree strongly. It's hard for me to accept the equivalency of a country like mine that fights wars with the United States, that invests in the United States, that sends thousands of its students to get educated here, and all of a sudden we have to share the region with a country that is on your terrorism list, that until 9/11 had killed more Americans than anyone else, and that continue to undermine your interest in the region today. So to me, us sharing the region with a country like that makes no sense.
One of the questions that we've received here is, how did you get to be an ambassador?
I will let them know as soon as I find out. No, the honest answer, I really don't know. I was recruited to work in the government 1998, end of 1998. So I joined His Highness Sheikh Mohammed, and I worked with him in Abu Dhabi for about 8 years. A lot of what I did focused on the US-UAE relationship. When I first started government, it was summer of 2000, and 1 year later, 9/11 happened. And so most of what we did was a lot of cooperation and coordination with the United States on military, security, intelligence, counterterrorism efforts. So most of what I did in my first year or two was working with the US. And so I think I developed sort of an understanding of this country and of the culture, and given the fact that I went to school here, I kind of just got tossed with that portfolio. So after 8 years of doing that, I was what I call pleasantly fired from my old job and sent to Washington, and I've been there since 2008.
Terrific. When I was living in the UAE for the 4 years ending in 2014, I, of course, followed the construction of a number of really iconic projects, a Guggenheim museum, a Louvre, a number of museums. We're sitting here in a museum, and one of the questions is, what role do you see museums playing in strengthening ties between the U.S. and the UAE?
When we talk about ties, we always talk about the traditional indicators, military cooperation or trade or investments, and it's data. We look at data, and that's how we measure a relationship. We rarely look at things like culture. We rarely look at things like art. A young friend of mine who lives in New York is a young Emirati opera composer, and he just had his first performance at Carnegie Hall 4 days ago, and it was fully sold out. I could be ambassador for 10 years, I can give 100 speeches like this. It doesn't come close to the kinds of bonds or understanding that an American who goes to Carnegie Hall to observe an opera, composed by an Emirati, can do. So these things, while difficult to quantify, have so much impact. And let me tell you a little bit about the thinking behind why we're building museums. So anyone here, if they decide they want to go to a world-class museum you think of New York, you think of Paris, you think London. Can you think of any world-class museum in the Middle East today? No. And so we want people to come for things like that. We want us to be a cultural capital in the Middle East. We want to be a tourism capital. We want to be a logistics capital. We want to be a financial capital. We want people to come to our country to see what we're able to do. We signed a contract with the Formula One race. I know there's a big Formula One race in Austin. And when someone asked my boss once, well, why? Why do you want a Formula One race? He said, I don't want the Formula One race. I want people to understand that we can put together a Formula One race.
The major industry in the eyes of many people in the Middle East is oil production. But as the U.S. becomes increasingly energy independent, how can the UAE ensure its economic future with the decline perhaps in oil demand?
So two things. Historically, the UAE has never exported oil west. We do not produce, put them on tankers and send them to Europe or the US. All our oil goes east. It goes to Asia. So whether you want our oil or not, we sell it in another direction. But I think the question has a broader point, is the historical framework of why the US cared about the Middle East was because of our oil, and in turn we got security. So you don't need oil from the Middle East like you did before, but other countries do. China still requires oil, Japan, Korea, India. So demand for oil isn't going anywhere anytime soon. Now the question is, do you still want to ensure the free flow of energy, regardless of where it goes? Or do you want to step back? And I think that's a question ultimately that people are wrestling with. Oil is going to be an important commodity, I think, for many years to come. You could step back and say, not our problem anymore, we're self-sufficient. Or you can say, no, we're still the global leader, we need to make sure this has safe passage wherever it goes. So I think that's a question that ultimately has to be answered here in the United States.
How engaged is the current administration in the issues of the Middle East as you see it? How do you feel about the level of engagement? Is it getting enough attention?
I think some issues are getting enough attention. Syria, Iraq, ISIS, I think they are getting enough attention because they have become crises. I heard someone say a few years ago, oh, well, now we need to address Syria and focus on Syria because the refugee flows is now affecting Europe. And I said, well, you only need to focus on it because now it's affecting Europe, but before that it was not an issue. 400,000 people got killed. 400,000 innocent people. We waited too long, I think, on Syria. And I'm not saying that if we started earlier we could have fixed it, but I'm just saying that the longer you wait, Syria is a perfect case study in ignoring it or avoiding it or pretending it's going to get resolved by itself only ensures that the problems get worse later on and the price tag to fix it becomes much bigger. In Syria, what happened was ISIS became stronger, the refugee flows increased, and Russia stepped in. And it's 1,000 times harder to fix now than it was maybe 3 or 4 years ago.
Now, the UAE has addressed the issue of Syrian refugees from time to time. Could you give the audience an update on what you've done to help those refugees and how many you've taken in?
We've taken in probably around 130 to 140,000. The only distinction I would make is we have not signed the Convention on Refugees. So we don't have, they don't enjoy the status of refugees in the UAE. So the 140,000 that we've taken in as people who come and work. In the UAE, you can't live in the UAE as an expat unless you have a job. So many of them have joined family members and relatives that already live there and are actually working. So we've taken in 140,000 Syrians, but I can't call them refugees. We've committed to taking in another 15,000. We've built refugee camps in Greece, in Lebanon, in Jordan. We have, I think we've donated approximately $900 million to humanitarian associations to facilitate and help. So we've done many things. I don't think the numbers that we can absorb are very difficult because of our demographics. And so for those of you who don't know, the UAE is a country of about 10 million people. But only 1.3 million of those 10 million are UAE nationals. So we are 10 million, we are 10% of our population. If the demographics here were like that, what would your refugee policy be?
Let me ask you about Israel. When I was serving as ambassador in Saudi Arabia 15 years ago, everything that was wrong with the world was stated to be the fault of Israel. Today, everyone says in the Middle East that it's the fault of Iran. Where do the Gulf states stand in relation to the state of Israel? I know there are commercial ties. I think I saw a report where Israel was selling Abu Dhabi a video surveillance system of some kind. Where does it stand in terms of the relationship?
The way most of us view Israel is we don't see Israel as an enemy. At the same time, there's this long-standing issue called the Palestine problem, which has not been resolved. We've made very clear, publicly and privately, that we are prepared to normalize relations with Israel as soon as there is a solution on the Palestinian issue. And it was indoctrinated into something called the Arab Peace Initiative. And it's been sitting around since 2002. No one has taken it seriously. But we thought that normalizing relations with 20 countries overnight would be a great incentive to move on the Palestinian issue. Unfortunately, it's been ignored. So if that is not a large enough incentive, I don't know what is. But we've made very clear there's nothing preventing us from getting closer than the Palestinian issue. And the Palestinian issue is important. You know, people forget that in our part of the world we have public opinion. People forget that our people are frustrated that Palestinians don't have a state. We ignore it because other problems have suddenly become more of a crisis. Syria, Iraq, ISIS, Iran. But the Palestinian issue is still very important. And ultimately it needs to get resolved. But I hope that the Israelis look at us as a balance, as an incentive, as a reward for finalizing a peace with Palestine.
What are the pressing human rights issues that you face in the UAE, and how are you devising solutions to those?
I think most of our challenges on the human rights is when it comes down to labor camps. And there are labor camps that are incredibly well enforced and have very high standards, and there's some that don't. Our ability to enforce the standards that the government put has been mediocre. I think we need to do better of enforcement. But Ambassador Jordan, I think it's important to recognize we're 44 years old. We're a work in progress. Human rights conditions today are much better than they were 5 years ago. And I think 5 years from now, they're going to be even better. So I am confident these problems will be fixed. I'm confident these problems are going to be addressed. But I want to share a small personal anecdote. Because when I first came to Washington, and I was still young and naive.
You're still young.
I came in and I said to myself, I am going to start working with an organization called Human Rights Watch. Human Rights Watch beats us up over the head every day. They call us out, they criticize it, no matter what we do. So I'm going to sit with them and I'm going to get this relationship on a healthy track. So I met with the lady who runs their Middle East department, and it was one of my first meetings in Washington. I remember it very good. I even remember what she wore. And I said, look, I'm here and I kind of want to start working with you. I think this is a very important issue for us. I want to start with a fresh page. Now, we're going to take steps. I would like that every once in a while you highlight one of those positive steps we've done, or just highlight something that we've done right, because that will allow us to take a further step. human nature. If you say we've done something right, it makes it easier for us to convince people to do something else. She looked at me, she goes, no, that's not how we work. We're only going to call you out. We're only going to criticize you. We're going to call you out for your flaws. And that's it. I said, thank you very much, but I won't be able to work with you. So I think it's important to distinguish reality on the ground from unattainable standards that certain human rights groups put together and say, no matter what you do, it's not going to be good enough. No matter what you do, we're going to call you out. So I think that's an unattainable bar. I'm gladly take some people and show them some of the camps that we have built to high government standards to show them that we are not against human rights. I mean, this is not something that's against our values. But don't take a standard that's unattainable and impose it on.
Yeah, in the same vein, there's always a lot of commentary about women's rights in the Middle East. Tell us what the UAE is doing in that regard.
I'm not worried about women's rights in the UAE. If anything, I'm now starting to worry about men's rights in the UAE. Take a look around, please. Look at my staff. Our cabinet in the UAE is 29 ministers, 8 of them are women. So a third of our cabinet are women. About 75 to 80% of our college student enrollment are women. About 60% of our public sector employees are women. I actually looked into this recently. Our maternity laws and rules in the UAE are far more generous than the US maternity laws. So trust me when I tell you, the women are doing just fine in the UAE.
As I recall, we have a new cabinet position, the Ministry of Happiness.
Yes?
And tell us what that's about.
Ministry of Happiness and Ministry of Tolerance. The Ministry of Happiness is actually it's designed to study and learn the best practices of what behavioral scientists have discovered and what makes a happy workplace. How do you go into your office and be excited? How do you work professionally with your colleagues? What is it that we need to do to set up a more productive, happier environment? So it is not a propaganda move. It is not something that we're doing for cosmetic or as a PR stunt. We're actually looking at the science behind it. The Minister of Tolerance is looking at how to work with other religious groups, with other cultural groups. In fact, we're talking to her now about what kind of churches she can visit in the US, synagogues, Jewish centers. And her mandate is to make sure we as a country are open and clearly conveying the message that we are an open, tolerant society.
And I can recall going quite openly to Christian churches in the UAE. It's quite different from some other countries. On a more personal level, one of the questions here is, what are the qualities or skills that have served you best as ambassador?
These are very difficult questions for me to answer. But let's pretend I'm not an ambassador. Let's pretend I'm an accountant or an engineer. I think any human being, the quality of understanding, listening, patience. I have 2 young children at home, and ever since I've had children, my focus in life is completely different. My focus in life is not about me, what I want to do. My focus is about how to make their life better, what I can provide for them. I think those are qualities people should aspire to have. I don't think it's exclusive to being a diplomat or being anything. I would like to be a good father, a good husband, a loyal employee, but I think most people think the same way. I mean, I don't think this is unique to me.
One of my students looked you up on the internet.
That can't be good.
Found some articles that said that you throw great parties.
First of all, That's a low bar in Washington. If anything ever said I could throw a good party in Dallas or in Miami, then I'll be very impressed.
Well, she wants to know what's the most memorable event or happening or the most fun time you had at one of these parties?
Two come to mind. One was a surprise party that my wife threw for me at our house and invited. We had just gotten married. Can't remember which birthday, but it was probably around 6 years ago, 5 or 6 years ago. And first, she didn't know most of my friends. She didn't know friends I had gone to high school with or college with. We had just gotten married. And somehow she found all of them. And many of them were living out of town, invited them, brought them in, and all of a sudden, we had this amazing party at our house with friends of mine from all over the place who just literally just showed up. So that to me was a very memorable evening. And then another party was my 40th birthday party where a few friends of ours and us went down to an island in the Caribbean called Anguilla, and we just had a really, really fun 3 days. Beach parties and dinners, and just, you know, when you're outside of your normal work environment and you're on a beach with your closest friends, you really can't go wrong.
And then now to do a complete U-turn back to other issues. What is the UAE's vision of how this quagmire in Syria could be resolved, if at all?
That's the toughest question. If I had an answer, we would be advocating it publicly every day. But I think this is one I really don't have an answer to. And it's probably easier to outline why we can't get an answer than it is to get an answer. I think the people invested in Syria or involved in Syria have conflicting objectives. Some people are preoccupied with removing Bashar. Some people are preoccupied with ISIS. Some people are preoccupied with the Kurds. Some people are all over the place. You have different disparate groups who are fighting each other as opposed to focusing on one target. Just imagine a team where everyone's shooting at a different target, where people are going in opposite directions. I think that's why we haven't been able to reach a conclusion. You know, we in the Gulf, you in the US, we want something completely different from what the Russians and the Iranians want. And so we're at this political stalemate, and it continues to get worse. So I wish I had an answer. It's actually very frustrating, but I think this is what happens when problems get ignored.
What advice would you give the next U.S. president about the Middle East when he or she takes office?
A lot of the leadership in the Middle East is going to be around for a long time. King Abdullah of Jordan, who's one of the most remarkable leaders in the Middle East today, is in his 50s. Sheikh Mohammed bin Zayed in Abu Dhabi in his mid-50s. Mohammed bin Salman in Saudi is 31. These are the reformers of our part of the world. These are the people who are going to change our region for the better, and they're going to be around for a long time. They're going to outlast this president, the next one, and probably the one after that. What's important to them is, again, what Marjorie said: trust, loyalty. Friendships, relationships are a two-way street. They're not a one-way street. We can't work with you if you expect us to focus on what's important for you and you ignore what's important for us. And I think this is what we're suffering from right now. We're being asked to focus on something that's very important for others, yet our concerns are not being taken into consideration. And so I think whoever wins in a few weeks needs to understand that. Needs to understand that these relationships, just like any relationship, just like your relationship with your spouse, it needs to be bilateral. It needs to be reciprocal. The days where we can sit back in our countries and expect the United States to come solve our problems for us, it's over. Nobody expects that anymore. We're not going to see 100,000 US soldiers deployed in the Middle East anytime soon. We understand that. But we live in a world, I think, going forward, where it's about burden sharing, where it's about sharing responsibilities, where it's about working together. And that understanding, that framework has to be ingrained. That has to be the software of the next administration.
In that vein, we've had presidents in the past who have been good at personal relationships with other heads of state, and we've had presidents who have not been so good. How important is the personal relationship between heads of state?
It's very important. Sir, you've served in Saudi Arabia, you know how it is. It's important for the person sitting across from you to feel that they can trust you, to feel that what you say to them is firm, is something they can rely on. And so, yes, the personal issues matter. It probably matters more in the Middle East than many others, but if you're running a 100,000 employee business or a store with 10 people, the most important asset you have are the people you have working for you. It always comes down to people. You can get the best technology or the best systems or the best whatever, but it's always going to come down to the human factor. And so yes, these relationships matter. We need to understand also that it's beyond just the administration. This is a failing on our part. One mistake many of us do is we overemphasize the relationship with the administration, usually the White House, and we ignore Congress, we ignore the media, we ignore think tanks, we ignore other states, and we focus on just the executive branch. And when that goes south, the whole thing goes south. So my advice to many of my colleagues is to reach out beyond Washington, is work with Congress, work with your business friends, work with partners. It could be anyone, it could be a hospital, it could be a school. But don't put all your chips on the White House, because if it goes south, then we're in trouble.
Absolutely. Let's look at OPEC for a second. There have been talks, preliminary talks, about production freezes or cuts, struggles to find ways to keep the price at a more attractive level for the producers. Where do you think that stands, and is that still relevant in that equation?
So just a piece of background. My father was the Minister of Energy in the UAE for 20 years, and I was probably the only teenager who would go on to OPEC conferences when he was 15 or 16. I was definitely the only teenager who thought it was cool. Back then, and this was probably in the late 80s, mid-80s, late 80s, when an OPEC conference took place, the whole world would stop. The UAE minister and the Saudi minister would walk in together. They would have pre-cooked whatever decision that they were going to make, and they would announce production increase, production cuts. It would affect the price, and they literally control the world oil market. That's very different from the world we live in today. OPEC is far less relevant. You have the United States that produces 10 million barrels a day. Russia produces 10 million barrels a day. So OPEC represents a smaller fraction of global oil production. I think what's important to watch is not what OPEC decides, and not what production cuts they agree to in OPEC. I think there's a channel going on in between Saudi Arabia and Russia. It's 20 million barrels of oil between them a day. If those two countries can reach an agreement on production levels, I think that's what we should keep our eye on. I think that will have more of an impact on prices than whatever OPEC agrees on.
And then what do you do about the U.S. shale producers who see the price inching up to $60, $65 a barrel, and then decide to jump back into the market and increase production even further?
There's nothing you can do about that. That market will balance itself out. They'll go in when it's profitable for them. They'll come out when the price is too low. There is nothing anyone can do about that. And you know better than I, in the U.S. production is private. There's no U.S. oil production company, unlike in many of our countries. And so market forces will balance that out on its own. I don't think there's much that can be done.
We have had in our presidential election contest some discussion about trade. There's been a lot of talk about NAFTA, there's been talk about the TPP. Are there trade vehicles between the U.S. and the UAE or other Middle Eastern countries that provide equivalent incentives to lower tariffs and to enhance trade?
We have, between the UAE and the US, a very robust trade relationship. We attempted negotiating a free trade agreement and it didn't work about 10 years ago. But despite that, the UAE has been the US's largest export market for the last 7 years in a row. And we're one of the few countries you have a 90% trade surplus. You export to us far more than we export to you. So the relationship bilaterally, trade-wise, is very healthy. The GCC, the Gulf Cooperation Council, has decided that from now on, they will negotiate as a collective force free trade agreements in the future. And so, given the domestic politics and the reactions to trade here in the U.S., I think the chances of a GCC-U.S. trade agreement is pretty slim.
How does the U.S. project strength without projecting arrogance?
That's a tough question. I think, like I said earlier, projecting strength, not necessarily just militarily. It's not just necessarily hitting back whoever hits you, but it's also taking the lead. It's also pulling all your friends aside and say, here's the play we're gonna run. You go this way, you go that way, call out the play, make sure everyone knows their role. Like I said, I don't think we live in a world where the US is gonna come in and kick the Iraqis out of Kuwait, like they did 20 years ago. It's not gonna happen like that. We live in a world where we're gonna have to work together, but we all look up to the US for leadership. We still do, we expect it. Maybe our expectations are unrealistic, but we look to the US for leadership. When there's a problem we can't solve by ourselves, we need your help. And so I think it's important to demonstrate strength by being a leader, but that leadership doesn't require you to impose your decisions or your will. I think if you think we are going to be a partner, you have to respect our views as well.
We couldn't have a discussion like this without at some point getting around to the Iran nuclear deal. Does the UAE still support the JCPOA? And if so, under what circumstances, and how well do you think it is being complied with?
We did support the JCPOA because the view from the Gulf is the Iranian nuclear program is less important to us than what Iran is doing in Saudi Arabia, in Bahrain, in Yemen, in Iraq. To us, Iran's behavior is the bigger problem. I don't care if Iran gets to keep 2,000 or 5,000 centrifuges under the deal. I'm one of the few people that's actually convinced the United States will never allow Iran to have a nuclear weapon. Never. So it's lesser of a concern. Iranian support for Hezbollah is a bigger concern. Iranian occupying my islands is a concern. Iranian testing missiles is a concern. Our view was if reaching the JCPOA allows us to refocus on Iran's behavior, then this is a good deal. But if the JCPOA then makes us fall hostage and makes us look the other way and say, oh no, Iran's not really doing this, or we don't want to push back because we don't want them to walk out of the deal, then no, this is a bad deal. So our judgment on whether it's a good deal or a bad deal is dependent on your policy to Iran the day after. That's how we judge whether it's a good deal or a bad deal. And like I was saying, Iran's behavior has gotten worse. It hasn't gotten better. I wish it had, but it hasn't. And by any barometer you choose to employ, Iranian behavior in the region has gotten more aggressive.
We've seen a lot of press in the last few months about the Saudi plan called Vision 2030. And the UAE has had similar projects, visions, Expo 2020, other kinds of visionary projects. Are these for real? Do you have any thoughts on how best the Saudis could go about following a path really that the UAE has been a trailblazer.
So I think the Saudis have concluded that the economy or the economic structure they have today, which is incredibly reliant on oil revenues, is not sustainable. Because sooner or later, oil's going to run out. And their population is growing. And they have no water, and they have nothing. And so if we don't wean ourselves off this addiction to oil, as Prince Mohammed bin Salman likes to call it, we are going to be stuck with our pants down at some point. Now, we learned that about 20 years ago. So today, the UAE GDP is 70% non-oil and gas. Our economy is only 30% related to our oil and gas sector, even though we produce 3.2 million barrels a day. So we started 20 years ago, we've reached that 30-70, and we're still trying to drive that 30% down. I think Saudi's starting now, it's going to take them a long time, but that's exactly where they need to go. You know better than I do, sir. It's unsustainable. They had to come to this conclusion, and better late than never. So even if they don't achieve economic plan 2030, 100%, if they achieve it 75%, it's still a positive change. It's still what Saudi Arabia needs to do. And it's our job to help them. It's our job to make sure they succeed. It's our job to make sure that Saudi Arabia remains stable, because no country has more impact on Islam than Saudi Arabia.
Just to answer the question, essentially it is keeping the price of oil low an advantage in terms of inflicting pain on Iran.
I mean, yes, it inflicts pain on us too. It's not necessarily it's something that we have designed. Like I said, I think we're probably a little more immune to lower oil prices than many of our friends, but we're still dependent on oil revenue. So, cut off your nose to spite your face isn't a very sound policy. I think Iran has bigger challenges than just their oil issues. I mean, they have 70% of their economy is dominated by the IRGC. There's corruption, there's unemployment, there's inflation, there's sanctions have been lifted, but not a lot of countries are going in to invest in Iran. So Iran has fundamental economic problems, of which one of them is oil, but it's not the only one.
What is the greatest challenge that you have faced in your investment?
I do get this question a lot, and I have a very simple answer. It's not Syria, it's not Yemen. It's trying to find the right balance between work and the family and the house. When things get busy, there's a lot of demands on one's time. I have to travel a lot, and I have to find the right balance between my work and my family. And that is always a constant struggle.
I think that's a pretty good way to leave it. Ambassador, I can't thank you enough for a fascinating, wonderful discussion.